as I said, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any questions, you can either post them in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll come to them at the end. This session is being recorded, so if you'd prefer not to have your face on camera, then please turn your camera off. That's great. Next slide, please. So we'll be starting today's session with a brief overview of the Accountability for Water programme, introducing the conceptual framework we've been developing over the course of our global evidence review into accountability and advocacy in the water sector, before exploring some of the key insights and emerging research priorities relating to the gender dynamics of water accountability. We'll then be concluding the session with contributions from 3 professional research fellows in Kenya and Tanzania, who have been undertaking original participatory action research into overlooked or neglected areas of water accountability interventions and how we can strengthen water governance within the sector. This is going to be the first of a 5-part series, and we've got 4 webinars coming up in the coming weeks that you'll be able to join, and we'll post details for that in the chat after, alongside the session. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, as I mentioned, today's webinar is the first of a 5-part series exploring key priority themes of relevance to policymakers, practitioners, and researchers within the water sector. And the foundation for this webinar series is the global evidence review that Water Witness has been undertaking over the past 2 years, investigating available evidence from a range of sources, exploring different aspects of accountability and advocacy within the water sector. So today's session marks the launch of the 3rd report on priority themes, and it follows 2 other reports which have been released previously. The first, an overview and summary results of the available evidence, and the second, which was exploring country level evidence for East Africa. And all 3 reports are available on the Accountability for Water website, which is accountabilityforwater.org. Within the reports, we aim to organize evidence around community dynamics, the enabling environment, and the governance dynamics which influence water accountability outcomes. And through this, we've aimed to develop a theory of change which can be applied within the sector. Within each report, we summarize the evidence and break it down for the reader with analysis to help identify key knowledge gaps and to guide future research priorities, which will enable us to strengthen water accountability. And as I mentioned, we'll be following up today's webinar with 4 more, exploring the role of donors, government responsiveness, how best to measure accountability, and the impact of closing civic space on accountability and advocacy in the water sector. So I'd like to introduce the conceptual framework that we have applied, and we've been exploring a range of different accountability mechanisms, from social accountability interventions such as citizen report cards to evidence-based advocacy, lobbying and campaigning, and statutory mechanisms such as public interest litigation, which have been used by citizens and advocates to try and influence water accountability outcomes, strengthening the quality of water and sanitation services, increase affordability, eradicate pollution, or improve equity in water sector outcomes. And we've tried to really theorize this accountability process through what we've dubbed the 5 R's of the accountability cycle, which has emerged over the course of analyzing evidence. And through this, we have identified 5 key preconditions which are required for accountability to be realized within governance processes. The first of those is a set of clear rules, norms, and standards which are in place and appropriate for accountability to occur. This must be followed by responsibilities and obligations which are clearly assigned and understood by different stakeholders. Importantly, there's a need for robust reporting and monitoring mechanisms which are widely available and used by different actors. And any problems which are reported or identified have to be reviewed and followed up with an explanation of performance by duty bearers. And finally, there must be subsequent reaction through corrective measures and sanctions if necessary to ensure that there's course correction within water governance and that everybody's voice is heard. And that's something that we can apply throughout all 5 of the priority themes that we explore in these webinar sessions, and I think has wider applicability for practitioners within the sector. And again, there's more detail on how we came up with this accountability cycle in the Knowledge Hub of the Accountability for Water website and within the reports themselves. Next slide, please. So each report, each chapter of the report on these different themes, we've organized to start with an evidence dashboard, which gives an overview of the evidence and a bit of a flavor of what evidence was available. So out of 151 high quality papers, which we arrived at for our total sample, a smaller number of those focus specifically on gender dynamics. And you can see on the left-hand side, in terms of evidence types, there was 5 organizational reports, 4 working papers, 7 journal articles. So those were like the main sources of evidence that we used for this analysis. You can also see the different types of accountability interventions which were examined within the literature, with a focus here for gender dynamics on strengthening citizen voice and social accountability. There was also some attention on budgetary work, for example, budget tracking and participatory budget processes. And this evidence dashboard has really been assembled to try and break down and disaggregate the unique characteristics for each theme, and is useful for trying to navigate the report. It shows where the data was gathered from, what the water sector focuses, and the frequency of different accountability mechanisms in relation to each theme. And again, within the gender section, you can see on the right-hand side that evidence was clustered in India and East Africa for gender. So there was much less literature available in other parts of the world. There was also a disproportionate focus on water, sanitation, hygiene, with less attention to water resource management and very little discussion of agricultural water management. Next slide, please. So over the course of this webinar, we're not able to cover everything comprehensively that is in the report. This is just aiming to give you a bit of a flavor of the headline findings and a sense of what the evidence is telling us at the moment. And I'm going to start just by introducing some of the key findings around community dynamics, which are relevant to gender in the water sector. So the first of those is that there is a real need for action to improve community education, training, and dialogue sessions that can centre women's voices. Women are often motivated to participate, but silenced or excluded due to lower rates of education, patriarchal norms, or the domination of decision-making spaces by men. So for example, 2 evaluations by United Nations Development Programme and SUI showed in their African stock-taking and integrity reports that men outnumbered women by 3 to 1 at water integrity sessions, which had been organised in the region. And additional training, which was organised by the East African Community Lake Victoria Basin Commission, was able to rectify this by increasing women's participation and contributions. And they did this through organising dedicated workshops for women that highlighted how gender inequality, the balance of power, and unethical practices were interrelated. This opened up space which allowed both subjects to be tackled together from different angles. A second key finding was that gender inequalities relating to water sanitation and hygiene and water governance created information asymmetries with uneven access to information. And what we found is that information sharing was really shaped around the gender division of labor. So for example, a study by Holvey et al. In Uganda showed how uneven access to water and sanitation services was reflected in the tendency for citizens of the same gender to associate and share information based on different gendered water practices. So different conversations relating to water occurred between men and women. So while women were responsible for domestic water use and water within the household, men were more concerned with water use in agriculture and for irrigation. And this informs the priorities that different genders had in terms of how water should be allocated and what the key focuses should be for operation and maintenance of water services. Because men were more dominant within water committees, this influenced and biased the decisions of water outcomes within those committees towards the needs of male water users. In terms of the enabling environment, what we found was that there was a key need was for sustained and reliable funding streams to resource grassroots women's groups and feminist organizations, which in turn were effective in increasing the inclusiveness of water and sanitation services, as well as improving the reliability and functionality of water services. So what we discovered was that there was evidence ranging from India to Nepal, Bangladesh, as well as from the Lake Victoria Basin, which highlighted how sustained and reliable funding was important in creating space for women to identify common priorities and undertake work in terms of advocacy around their collective needs. For example, relating to the proximity of water points to their homes in terms of broadening access to water, sanitation and hygiene in informal settlements, and in terms of raising issues such as the safety of women and girls during water collection. A second key finding was around the broader patriarchal structures which continue to influence decision-making. And there was some evidence to show how sexist professional cultures tended to impair decision-making and priority setting within the water sector, privileging technocentric focus at the expense of social science perspectives that recognized different gender-related needs. So for example, a multi-country study of South Asian women water professionals by Sopicom found that technical and administrative capabilities, for example, from engineering, were privileged over the social science perspectives and engineering and expertise. Cultural power dynamics prevented the emergence of prospective water champions and inhibited perspectives that would have permitted greater responsiveness to the needs of women and girls, again with different experiences, for example, during pregnancy, while menstruating, or during water collection where harassment might occur. In terms of the governance dynamics, there were a couple of really key findings that we found out. First of all, there was some literature focusing on gender responsive budgeting and how impactful this could be in terms of strengthening accountability, both in terms of improving spending decisions and meeting the needs of the whole community. So a key paper here was one by Nas et al. From 2018, which focused on gender responsive budgeting in Ethiopia and illustrated the transformative impacts that it could have in terms of transforming the attitudes of both men and women, identifying and recognizing key needs for wash services that were previously unaddressed, and in stimulating government authorities to upgrade sector action plans and improve education around water, sanitation and hygiene, as well as upgrading water supply infrastructure. We also observed that women's representation was really important to strengthen trust in water governance institutions, but was insufficient on its own. What was also needed was women's leadership to stimulate more equitable and responsive water service delivery and open up space for citizens to better articulate their needs. So a paper from Masanyua and focusing on Tanzania showed how decentralization had created space for greater participation by women, but their roles had largely remained quite passive, with their ability to speak up and influence water outcomes constrained by patriarchal norms. Disabling factors included the lack of education, illiteracy, lower status occupations, and additional household duties, which also created less willingness to engage in political and power bargaining. And consequently, while there was some representation of women on water committees, they tended to be limited to secretarial treasurer roles rather than holding leadership positions. As I mentioned, there were many other findings and emerging insights that we cover within the report, but we couldn't cover everything here. What we did try to do is condense the evidence to sift through it and identify key research priorities around gender, which should be investigated in the future. The first of those is that more attention is needed in terms of gender representation within water governance institutions and how best to tackle structural barriers that limit women's leadership in decision making, including water committees in water utilities and other water authorities as well. Secondly, there was a need for greater attention to statutory accountability. Practitioners need a much better understanding of how accountability mechanisms such as citizen oversight panels, formal audit and disclosure, and ombudsman services intersect with gender dynamics, and how gains in gender equality can be institutionalized and mainstreamed across the public sector. Thirdly, there was a need for greater attention to the political economy and the overarching cultural context. So what we observed is that while there was some attention to this in the papers, gendered labor, especially in feminized sectors such as agriculture or the textile industry, was not really covered in great depth. And these sorts of labor practices greatly determine the ability of women workers to contribute to governance processes and participate in accountability processes and mechanisms. Similarly, emerging issues and identified, such as around menstrual hygiene management or harassment and extortion, and COASNET, one of the accountability for water partners, has been undertaking new research around the impact of sextortion in Kenya on water services for women. These have not really been covered in great detail in the literature and would benefit from further study. Finally, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was not investigated in the literature, which dated from before the pandemic began, but it does throw up many new issues and challenges which are relevant to thinking about water accountability. So I think it would be invaluable to examine how COVID-19 has influenced how women engage in accountability processes and the impact it's had on gendered wash inequalities. We can consider the extent to which the pandemic has exacerbated gender inequalities around wash access and governance, considering factors such as changing work patterns, increasing care burdens, and changes to mobility as well. Next slide, please.